My name is Rowan Vance, and I have been called many things: Titan, shark, visionary, when the press is feeling generous. I built fleets and fortunes out of steel and storms, container ships crossing oceans wearing my name like a crown. I learned early that numbers never lie if you know how to read them. Balance sheets are the most honest mirrors in the world. They show you who you are. The morning it all began, the sea outside our Newport house wore the same winter grey as the marble floor beneath my slippers. I woke before dawn, as I always do, to the soft ache in my bones that wealth never cured. The house was sleeping. The only thing moving was the blue light of the kitchen's fridge and the metronome tick of the grandfather clock that has outlived 3 marriages and 2 crashes. I did not intend to pry. I intended to love my wife better by understanding the pressure she said she felt. That was the lie I told myself while I sat at the kitchen island with a mug of coffee, her laptop open, the familiar banking portal waiting for a code that I knew by heart, because she had once asked me to set it up. I was old enough to be her father many times over. I was also old enough to know that the young can drown in luxury as quickly as the poor drown in debt. I wanted to make sure she was not in over her head. Her name is Isla. She's 37 years younger than I am, and the only person who has ever walked into my life like sunrise. She speaks softly, but her laughter breaks through rooms like champagne. She says I am dramatic when I call her the tide that pulled me back from a shoreline of emptiness. Maybe I am. When a man spends decades negotiating freight rates and buying politicians to pave port lanes, romance looks like a trick mirror. Isla made it look real. The statements loaded, and I saw it at once. The pattern, the heartbeat of a secret. Small transfers from her personal account to a place I had never seen. Orchid Trust, LLC. The name felt manufactured, the kind of shell we used to park assets offshore. The amounts were irregular, 2,000 here, 9,000 there, a sudden 38,000 with no memo line. Then cash withdrawals, always on Thursdays, always in the Ravenwood district where I would never let her go alone. Receipts from a diner that smelled of frying oil, a pay-by-the-week motel where dreams go to rot, and deliveries to a nondescript warehouse address on Fleet Avenue. My chest went cold, as if the ocean had reached into the house and pressed its hand against my heart. The coffee tasted like sand. I clicked deeper and found wire transfers to a clinic I did not fund, a foundation I did not recognize, and a legal retainer under the name of a man who had once tried to sue my company for a wrongful death at the docks. His name sat there in black and white like a fingerprint on a glass. Malik Rahman. The clock ticked louder. Somewhere upstairs the radiator sighed like a restless sleeper. I enlarged the line items until the numbers filled the screen. My reflection stared back at me from the glass. A tired old king guarding a crumbling castle. Money does not vanish in my world. When it moves, it announces its intentions with brass bands and signatures. This money moved like a thief. I told myself there were explanations. Charity, perhaps. A surprise, a project she wanted to keep private so it would belong to her alone. I have funded museums and hospitals and named wings after friends I pretended to love. I have seen goodness dressed as attention and attention dressed as goodness. But cash withdrawals in Ravenwood were not philanthropy. Cash in that neighborhood bought silence. I checked the dates. The pattern had begun 3 months ago, right after Isla's texts grew shorter and her eyes returned from somewhere I could not follow. I thought of the arguments that had hung in the air like humidity, the dinners she suddenly attended alone, the lies I had told myself about how different we were, how I only wanted her happiness. An old man wants to believe he can be enough. An old man with too much money wants to believe he can fix what he cannot hold. The last entry was yesterday. 9,000 withdrawn at a kiosk behind a liquor store that sells counterfeit champagne to bachelorette parties. A ride share to an address near the docks. A florist on Edgewood with a receipt for yellow tulips. I knew that florist. It is where young men buy forgiveness and older men buy courage. It felt as if the numbers were speaking to me in a language I had once invented and somehow forgotten. I closed the laptop and the room shrank. The air went thin. Outside, the sea lifted its shoulders in the dim pre-dawn. I had loved Isla with the clumsy devotion of a man who has led armies and never learned how to ask for a hug. I had promised her safety. I had never promised her trust. On the marble, the laptop glowed like a small blue wound. I touched the screen and left a smear where my finger shook. I knew then that I would follow this thread to wherever it led. I knew that whatever I found would not give me back the man I had been before I pressed enter on that banking portal. My blood had cooled into glass. My breath came as if through a straw. I whispered her name and it broke in my mouth. And even then, with fear at my throat and proof on the screen, I did not understand that the numbers were not pointing at betrayal. They were pointing at a door I had never opened, a part of my wife I had never asked to see. I thought I had found the truth. I had only found the first shadow of it. The first time I saw Isla, she was arguing with a curator in the echoing hall of the Whitney. She wore a dress like a whisper and a stubbornness that reminded me of the tide. She was 26 and called me Mr. Vance until I told her not to. She said wealth should listen more than it speaks. I offered her a position on a board. She declined and asked for a book recommendation. She read it twice and wrote in the margins. A year later, we were married in a church that smelled of salt and candle wax. My friends called it foolish. Her friends called it brave. Everyone called it something. We called it ours. We built a life that paparazzi tried to photograph and always missed. We made promises in the quiet of mornings and then spent the day running away from them because that is what our lives required. There were parties with ceilings painted like the sky, dinners where men in dark suits flirted with corruption and called it policy. There were nights when Isla would push off her shoes, climb onto the kitchen counter and eat cereal out of the box, while I counted cargo ships in my head to fall asleep. There was laughter that sounded like a second youth. There were silences that arrived like fog. I do not sell my life to the public, but you are here to hear the truth, and I'm old enough to owe it to you. If you have not done so yet, subscribe and tell me where you are listening from. The places you carry in your bones change the way you read a story. I have always believed that geography is destiny and that the streets you learn to cross at 13 shape the way you handle danger at 63. Tell me your city. Tell me your coastline. I will tell you mine. The pattern in Isla's statements itched at me all day like a rash under a tuxedo. I pretended nothing was wrong. She entered the breakfast room late, hair damp, skin clean, wearing the soft sweater I had bought in Florence, where the saleswoman had called me Caro in a way that meant father to some and fool to others. Isla kissed my head, the soft spot where hair had surrendered, and reached for a slice of pear. Her phone vibrated. She silenced it without looking. The gesture was small and knife-sharp. I bled inside it. In the car to the foundation luncheon, she talked about a mural project for the public elementary school near Harbour Street. Her voice carried a brightness that used to warm me. I heard it now the way a sailor hears laughter on the night before a storm. When the driver turned toward the avenue, I told him to take the long way. Isla smiled and said she had time. She always had time until she did not. I contacted Dixon when she went to change. He had been my head of security for a decade and had the kind of face that door guys call sir. He understood that fear is a currency and he knew how to spend it. I told him I needed a new set of eyes on the household. He asked me if we were threatened. I told him yes and did not lie about what threatened us. He said he would be discreet. He always is. At lunch, the wives compared gemstones the way men compare scars. I watched Isla watch a volunteer speak about a tutoring program in Ravenwood. Her expression softened, as if her muscles remembered a language she had not used in years. After the speech, she disappeared for 5 minutes. When she returned, her cheeks were flushed and her eyes were bright. She said the food was too salty. I said the speeches were too sweet. We both smiled as if we were not drowning. That afternoon, I pretended to nap in the library and listened to the second-hand carved time into something you can never spend twice. The house smelled of old wood and new wealth. In the late daylight, the portrait of my grandfather seemed to disapprove from the wall. He had worked the docks with hands that split and bled and refused to heal because work does not wait. He would have told me to deal with it like a man. He would have broken something just to hear the sound. When Isla left for a yoga class, Dixon texted me that the car had turned not toward the studio but south, into the streets where money changes hands without paperwork. I stood so fast the chair barked against the floor. I told myself I would give her the benefit of the doubt. Then I told myself that benefit is a word for people who cannot face the interest it accrues. I had always believed that the worst thing you can do to a marriage is to confuse suspicion with proof. But the statements had spoken, and now every shadow looked like a witness. I asked my banker, Clara, for a quiet review of all accounts linked to Isla's name. Clara has a voice like a velvet rope. She said of course and did not ask why, because she knows that why is a liability. Within the hour, she sent me a report that made my eyes sting. There were transfers to the Harbour Light Youth Clinic, a cash-only operation that treats children whose parents fear paperwork more than sickness. There were payments to a law firm known for asylum cases. There were receipts from a bodega where the back room sells prepaid phones. There were entries labelled tutoring, coded in a way that meant nothing unless you knew which ledger to hold it against. I knew a ledger when I saw one. This one was keeping me at arm's length. The name appeared again. Dr. Malik Rahman, the retainer, the clinic. He had stood on the steps of the courthouse a decade ago and called me a vulture in a suit because a crane on my site had collapsed and taken a man to the bottom of the harbour. We settled with his client for a sum that made my lawyers look noble. He looked at me as if I had personally tightened the bolts. The world is not fair. It is only efficient. Now Rahman's name sat inside my wife's money like a thorn in an apple. Dixon's next update landed. Isla's car had parked near a brick building with a mural of a lighthouse painted on the wall, the kind of paint that peels into history. She entered with a man whose shoulders carried more weight than his posture allowed. Dixon sent a photo from the street. The man was Rahman. He handed her a folder. She touched his arm. My breath went short. Tell me where you are listening from. Tell me if your city has a neighborhood where hope wears hand-me-downs. I want you to imagine your partner walking into that neighborhood with a man who once called you a murderer, while your money disappears into the same alleys. Imagine the noise that makes in your head. Imagine the way the floor tilts under your shoes. I stared at the photo until my eyes watered. I told Dixon to keep his distance and to keep recording. I looked at the portrait of my grandfather, and for the first time in my life, I looked away first. I did not know then that my wife's hands were busy holding together a world I had never bothered to see. I only knew that a man I distrusted had stepped into my marriage, and I was about to step into a room that would change me. The next week, I lived in a country called Doubt. Its language is a hiss and its flag is a stain. I moved through my days with the smile of a host and the heart of a hostage. I told Isla I had meetings and took meetings with no one except my fear. I fed it timelines and it grew sharper. I fed it photographs and it grew teeth. Dixon's reports came in clean lines and short sentences. Isla met Rahman twice more. Once at a diner with a cracked window and a waitress whose hair remembered the 80s. Once at the back entrance of a community centre where children's voices spilled out like sparrows. There were no embraces beyond the polite. There were folders. There was urgency. There were glances like signals. There was a bruise on Isla's wrist one day that she waved away as clumsy. I had told myself that if I ever suspected a betrayal, I would confront it like a storm, head-on, with ballast and steel. Instead, I watched and collected and let the weight pull me under. This is the secret cowardice of powerful men. We prefer information to confrontation because information obeys. People do not. Clara called and told me she had found a second account, a small one, opened in Isla's maiden name. The deposits came from the sale of a painting she had refused to let me buy for her, and from the partial liquidation of a trust her grandmother had left her. The withdrawals went to prepaid cards, which went to cash, which went to receipts that spelled the outline of something like a plan. There was a rental of a storage unit near Fleet Avenue. There were purchases of blankets, children's shoes, thermometers and textbooks. I sat with the list and felt something break that was not anger. If I had been the kind of husband who leaves well enough alone, I might have recognized the shape of giving before the stink of suspicion smothered it. But the humiliation of the age gap has a mean little voice. It tells you that youth will always choose its own kind in the end. It tells you to fortify, to defend, to control. I hired a private investigator named Greer, a woman with eyes that had never once been surprised. She pried doors open for a living and charged accordingly. Within 3 days, she had a file thick as a courthouse sandwich. Photos of Isla at the Harbour Light Clinic speaking quietly with mothers whose belts held the world together. Receipts from a restaurant where she paid for 10 meals and took none. The key to the storage unit. Inside, cots, bottled water, first aid kits. A hand-painted sign that said, Saturdays 2 to 5 Homework Club. In the middle of the file was another photograph. Isla with Rahman on the steps of the clinic, their bodies angled close because the wind was cold, and words travel better across short distances. Her face was lit with that kind of focus she used to reserve for me when I told her about a ship that made it through a storm by 10 minutes. She was not looking at him the way a lover looks. She was looking at him the way a soldier looks at a comrade when the plan involves a wall and a rope. Greer said she could not find anything that smelled like an affair. She said my wife had a project. She said my wife was not sharing it with me. She asked why that was. I told her questions were not part of the fee. She told me that answers rarely are. The next twist arrived without knocking. A message from a burner number appeared on my phone. Stop snooping. You have no idea what you are touching. I stared at it until the words lost their meaning. My phone rang with a number I knew too well. A reporter who owed me favors asked if I wanted to comment on rumors that Vance Maritime had been shipping medical supplies without paying import duties. I realized the burner had not been sent to me by chance. I had stepped into a game that involved more than my marriage. That night, Isla came to bed with eyes red from wind. She turned away from me and breathed like a woman climbing a hill. I reached for her shoulder. She twitched and apologized. I said nothing because my vocabulary had been replaced by a law firm's. I lay awake and counted the seconds until morning. The clock ticked like a distant hammer. I decided to confront Rahman first. When I called his clinic, the receptionist told me he was not taking new patients. I said I was not a patient. I said I was a problem. She went silent in a way that meant she was deciding between fear and protocol. She put me on hold. He came on the line, his voice the same measured baritone I remembered from the courthouse steps. We met the next day on a bench across from the lighthouse mural. Children chased a ball that had been mended 3 times with duct tape. He looked older, grayer. His hands still moved when he spoke, the hands of a man used to telling hard truths to people who cannot afford bad news. I told him to stay away from my wife. He told me to sit down before I made a fool of myself. He said my wife was saving my soul without my consent. He said she had been funding temporary housing for families who were 1 rent payment away from the street. He said Harbour Light had lost a donor and a state grant on the same day, and Isla had stepped in because children cannot wait for budgets to balance. He said the prepaid phones were for mothers who needed to call for help without alerting the men who hurt them. He said the legal retainer was for asylum cases for children who had crossed borders in shoes thinner than promises. He said I could ask Isla about any of it if I lowered my voice long enough to listen. I told him to stop playing the hero. He said he had no time to play anything. He said the money was running out. He said the danger was rising. He said someone was watching the clinic and the storage unit. He said someone had followed Isla last Thursday. His eyes warmed with something like pity. He asked me if that someone was mine. I lied and said no. The lie tasted like rust. He told me that a developer was trying to buy the block and wanted the clinic gone. He told me that a councilman I shook hands with last month was owned by a shell company whose paperwork I would recognize if I looked closely. He told me that a donation from my foundation could save the clinic. He told me that Isla had begged him not to ask me because she said I would make it about optics and photos and checks with too many zeros and not enough heart. I burned where I sat. I am a man who has donated libraries and never read in them. I am a man who has cut ribbons with scissors heavier than regret. I am a man who can fix pipes and economies and broken contracts. I did not know how to fix the fact that my wife could not trust me with the part of her that did not need fixing. I stood and told Rahman that if he contacted my wife again, I would bury his clinic in legal paperwork until the ink drowned it. He looked at me with a sadness that did not belong to me. He said, "Do what you must." He said the children would still be here tomorrow. He said the storm had already started. He said there were other threats I did not see. I walked away in a wind that tore at my coat. I told Dixon to double the watch. I told Clara to freeze every account I could without alerting Isla. I told Greer to dig into the developer and find the strings. I told myself that control is love when you are afraid of losing everything. I was wrong, and the proof was waiting for me in a place that I had never entered because my money had always kept me in a safer kind of shame. The storm chose a Saturday. The sky had the color of a bruise, and the air bit like a promise you cannot keep. The Homework Club sign leaned on its nail outside the community center on Fleet Avenue. Children arrived in coats too thin, carrying backpacks that made their shoulders slope like old men's. Isla was there early, sleeves pushed up, hair pulled back, moving tables the way you move a wall you have decided will not hold you back. She laughed with a girl whose front teeth had not grown in yet. She set out notebooks. She set out bananas. She set out a smile that made the room warmer. I stood across the street in a car that smelled of leather and mistakes, watching through a crack in the window. Dixon sat beside me like a statue with a radio. Greer was in the alley. Clara was on standby. I had built a network of control so tight it strangled the oxygen out of the day. My chest felt hollow. My hands felt old. The developer's men appeared first, not in suits, in jackets that zipped up over indifference. They leaned against a truck with a city permit taped to the windshield that no one would question because such questions cost careers. They spoke into their sleeves and smirked at the children because life had smirked at them first. Then the police cruisers rolled up slow, lights polite, a show of civility before the show of force. A complaint had been filed about unsafe occupancy, about unlicensed tutoring, about fire code violations. The kind of complaint that uses paperwork to evict compassion. I stepped out of the car and the wind slapped me. Dixon asked me to wait. I did not. I crossed the street, tasting metal. Inside, Isla looked up and the shock on her face went white, then pink, then something I hope to never see again. Rahman was at the back, pointing at a bucket under a leak, talking about mold to a volunteer. He turned when he felt the temperature change. The officer in charge entered with a clipboard jaw and eyes that scanned for rules broken rather than rules worth breaking. He announced the inspection. The room went quiet the way rooms do when children learn how power enters. The smallest girl clutched her backpack straps so hard her knuckles went chalk. A boy whispered to his sister that they were not supposed to talk to uniforms. The sister hugged him with the fast arms of someone who has learned too much too early. I said, "This is private property." The officer said the city has concerns. I said the city has owners. He asked if that was a threat. I said it was a fact. Rahman stepped in front of me with his hands open, a surgeon about to attempt a risky repair. He told the officer the children needed 1 more hour. He told him the paperwork was on its way. He told him to look at the roof and tell him if the leak looked like a criminal. The developer's men shifted, and one of them nodded at a man near the door I had not noticed. He wore a black jacket with a patch on the sleeve none of us wanted to see. Immigration. Someone had chosen today for a sweep. Someone had chosen this room where homework papers lay like small flags of hope. Someone had decided that fear would do the work that money could not. Isla moved to the center of the room. Her voice rose. She told the children to sit. She told the mothers to breathe. She told the officer that the complaint could wait an hour because the children were in the middle of learning. She looked at me as if begging me to be the man she told them I was. My pride lifted its head like a snake. I opened my mouth to defend with threats and lawyers and television crews. The power went out. The room exhaled darkness. The smallest girl began to cry. The sound cut through me like truth. Phones lit up like fireflies. Rahman's voice came steady and low. Dixon's hand went to his radio. Greer's voice crackled in my ear that the permit on the truck was forged, and the councilman's shell company did indeed run through a trust on the Isle of Man that I had used in a different lifetime for a different sin. Everything I had built to protect myself was now a map for other men's games. And then the twist that split me open. A woman pushed through the crowd toward Isla, shoving a file into her hands, saying the judge had moved the date, and a child named Javier would be deported by Monday if a signature was not secured by sunset. The boy stood near the table with his eyes too old. Isla's hands trembled as she scanned the papers. She looked at Rahman, and then at me, and then at the door where the patch on the jacket glowed like a warning. She turned and shouted my name. Not Mr. Vance, not darling, Rowan. She said it like a lifeline and like an indictment. She said if I ever loved her, I would sign as the guarantor for the boy's bond because I had the standing and the credit and the power to make a system blink. She said I could save him now, or I could keep pretending that money is not an oath. The room wavered like heat. All the vanity I had carried into this room crumbled like chalk. I saw Isla then as I had refused to see her. Not as a wife who had stepped out of her lane, as a woman who had built a road where the city would not pave. I saw Rahman not as a rival, but as a man pulling with her against a machine. I saw the children not as pawns in a fight over loyalty, but as the reason loyalty matters. The officer cleared his throat, ready to proceed. The man with the patch shifted his weight like a clock striking the hour. I felt the floor tilt toward a cliff. I took the file from Isla. My signature shook so hard the pen tore the paper. I told the officer that if he removed one child from the room, I would melt his pension into headlines so fast his grandchildren would feel the heat. I told the man with the patch that if he tried to turn this room into a raid, I would bring more cameras than his supervisor had ever seen. I told the developer's men to take their counterfeit permit and find another block to poison. I told Dixon to show them the photographs we had of their intimidation last week. He did. The men left with their indifference zipped tight. The power returned in a cough. The lights flickered. The smallest girl laughed, a hiccup of relief. The officer swallowed paperwork. The man with the patch waited at the door, thwarted but not finished. The storm outside rattled the windows as if reminding us that victories are rented, never owned. Isla's shoulders dropped. Rahman's eyes closed for a second, like a prayer that does not ask for anything. I handed the file back to my wife, and she pressed her hand to my chest, where the cold had lived for so long it had my name. She whispered, "Thank you," and I wanted to say sorry for 1,000 small cowardices. I wanted to say I should have been here before the sirens. I wanted to say I did not know how to be a better man until this room taught me. From the doorway came a voice I recognized with the ache of history. The councilman whose hand I had shaken last month stepped in, rain on his coat, smile on his face, ready to deliver mercy like a favor. He announced he had arrived to ensure the city acted with compassion. He said he had heard there were misunderstandings. He said a benefactor had promised a generous donation if the clinic could demonstrate compliance. He looked at me as if I were his mirror. He looked at Isla as if she were his stage. I told him the donation would arrive. I told him the compliance would be met. I told him the conditions would be ours, not his. I told him to leave before the room learned a new vocabulary for deceit. He left, thin lips pressed together like a signature he wished he had not used. I thought the storm had spent itself. I thought we had pulled the room back from the cliff. I thought we had survived the worst. Then Greer's voice hit my ear again. The burner number that had warned me was back. A message for Isla this time. Stop or your husband's ships will stop. The rumor about duties had not been a rumor. Someone was going to make it true. The war I had joined to save one boy would follow me back to the ocean where I make my living. I looked at Isla and saw the fear land, heavy and familiar, the fear women learned to fold into their wallets next to the family pictures. She squared her shoulders. She told the children to open their notebooks. She told me to stand with her or get out of the way. Her voice did not shake. I stood. The room steadied, and even in that moment of found courage, I felt the horizon darken in a way that said money would not be enough, lawyers would not be enough, and pride would be poison. What I had thought was the end of the battle was only the first line of the first page. The days that followed did not give us back what we had lost. They gave us a different thing. They gave us a truth that had the weight of work. We moved fast because fear always does. I opened my books to auditors I chose for their hunger rather than their loyalty. We paid duties that had been neglected by men I had trusted to skim the law without sinking the ship. I fired them. I called the press before the press called me. I said the scandal out loud and swallowed my pride like a pill you do not want to take, but have decided will keep you alive. The headlines burned for a week. Then they cooled into lessons I could not afford to forget. I asked Isla to walk me through the project she had built in secret. We sat at the kitchen island where this began, only now the laptop belonged to both of us. She showed me spreadsheets that were not elegant, but they were honest. She showed me lists of children and mothers and fathers trying to be better than their worst day. She showed me photos of field trips where kids learned that a museum belongs to them when they stand in it. She showed me letters written in the messy lines of hope. I asked her why she had not told me. She said because the first time she tried, I suggested a gala. She said because the second time she tried, I made a joke about optics to hide the fact that I was afraid of feeling something I could not manage. She said because the third time she tried, my phone buzzed and I answered it. She said because she wanted one corner of our life that was not measured in press hits and naming rights. She said because secrets are not always betrayals. Sometimes they are the only way to build a fire in a house made of ice. I listened. I did not defend. The hardest thing I have ever done in a life of hard things was to let my wife tell me how I had failed her without interrupting to explain why. When she finished, I told her I was sorry. I told her I was ready to be taught. I meant it with a humility that startled the part of me that prefers to be sure. We created the Open Ledgers Fund, not named after me, structured so that every dollar could be tracked by the people whose lives it touched. We moved Harbour Light out from under the threat of a single grant and a single councilman. We bought the building so no one could walk in with a forged permit again. We hired tutors and paid them well. We trained volunteers to do more than soothe. We rebuilt the roof so rain would be nothing but weather. We set up a legal clinic with teeth. I asked Rahman to sit on the board and gave him the chair. He said he would if the first rule of the board was that I would not speak first. I told him to put it in writing. He did. We laughed with the cautious laughter of men who have thrown stones at one another across years and now stand in the same river washing their hands. Not every story found a happy ending. Some families moved in the night and left behind drawings on the walls that made me cry when I found them. Some cases were lost because justice is a machine that grinds slowly and sometimes never. But we won enough to keep moving. We won enough to teach me that saving the world is less glamorous than saving a morning, and that both are worth the price. And Isla. I learned my wife again. I learned the cadence of her patience and the courage of her anger. I learned that trust is not a document you sign, but a daily deposit that looks like attention and sounds like yes. We rebuilt the part of our marriage that had been made from fear and replaced it with a different architecture. We stopped dressing love in silk and put it in work clothes. We stopped calling generosity a strategy and started calling it a duty. If you are still with me, take this with you. The worst thing in my story was not a bank statement or a photograph or a rumor that could turn ships around. The worst thing was the story I told myself to protect myself, the story that said control is love and secrecy is betrayal and money is proof of goodness. The truth was simpler and harder. Love is trust with deeds attached. Secrecy can be protection when the house is cold. Money is only a tool, and a blunt one, unless it is wielded with humble hands. Subscribe if you believe stories can change the way we carry our power. Tell me where you are listening from, because I want to know which streets taught you your courage. And if you are holding a secret that keeps children warm, I will tell you what my wife taught me. Some secrets are lanterns. Hold them high until others can see by them, then show them where you hid the matches. I checked the bank statements and froze because I thought numbers never lie. I learned that the truth lives in the spaces between them, in the rooms where children practice spelling their own names, in the hands of a woman brave enough to build a road without waiting for permission. The old billionaire in me did not die. He learned how to kneel and listen. He learned how to sign a different kind of check. Here is the lesson I paid for with pride. Do not wait for a storm to decide who you are. Choose now. Choose the kind of power that does not need credit to do good. Choose the kind of love that can survive the audit. And when you find yourself freezing at a screen full of numbers, step away and ask who those numbers are trying to feed, to shelter, to save. Then act. The sea outside our house is the same color on most mornings, gray like steel, soft like the inside of old shells. When the light hits it, it glitters, not like diamonds, like water, honest, moving, enough.